All right, so you're here with us on the deep dive because, well, you want to learn stuff, right? Fast and like without feeling completely overloaded. You want those, those aha moments, the stuff that just clicks and
Yeah.
makes sense. Well, you're definitely in the right place because today we're tackling something super practical that can honestly make a huge difference in how you come across in English. We're talking about
Okay.
mastering English pronunciation. So think of this deep dive as your like express lane to sounding clearer, more confident when you speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sent over some excerpts from Mastering Pronunciation, Tips and Tricks for Clearer English. It's by the Motivated Mind Zone. And it's chock full of really great hands-on advice. And what we're going to do today is try to pull out the most effective techniques,
Yeah.
so you can speak with greater ease and assurance,
Yeah.
really make it easier to communicate.
Yeah, and we're going to start by looking at why pronunciation actually matters. And it's about way more than just avoiding those awkward moments.
Yeah.
Then we'll get into the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts of how to actually make the right sounds, both vowels and consonants. Um and then finally we'll explore how the rhythm and melody of English, that's, what we call stress and intonation, play a massive role in how fluent you sound.
Yeah, these are the elements that really help to
Yep.
to elevate your English.
Okay, so why does this all matter? Let's dive right in. Why does pronunciation matter?
Well, I think the material you sent really emphasizes that it's about ensuring that, your message comes across clearly. It's not just about technical correctness. It's about making sure that whoever's listening to you understands your ideas clearly.
Yeah, and they make that point so well with an example that's kind of jarring. The difference between sheet and, well, shit.
Right.
Just a tiny little slip of the tongue there can lead to a completely different and potentially very awkward situation.
Yes, absolutely.
That kind of example really makes you sit up and pay attention.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. It really highlights that, small differences in pronunciation can have such a massive impact on meaning. And it shows us that, it's not just a minor detail. It's actually a fundamental part of getting your message across in a way that is accurate and understood by the listener.
Yeah, and it's not just about, dodging those big obvious errors either. The
Mhm.
source also talks about how even if you don't have what some people might call a perfect accent, speaking clearly really does give your confidence a boost.
Yeah.
When you know you're being understood, you naturally feel more comfortable, speaking up in all sorts of situations, whether it's with friends, giving a presentation at work.
I think that's such a key point. That idea that when you feel confident and you know that you can communicate effectively, those two things really work together. And when you're not worried about people understanding you, then you can actually focus on what you want to say. And that's really what makes your communication better.
Yeah, and here's something that, you might not think about straight away. When you pronounce things clearly, it makes your interactions with native speakers much smoother. They're more likely to, engage with you positively when they can easily follow what you're saying. So it really helps build those connections.
Yes. It's like you're reducing the cognitive load for them to have to decipher what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it helps them really focus on what you're saying rather than how you're saying it.
Okay, so now let's go beyond just those individual sounds. The
Hmm.
source also talks about these more subtle things, like where you put the stress in a word
Yeah.
and the rise and fall of your voice, and how they're really important for sounding fluent. It's not just about saying the words correctly. It's
Yeah.
about getting that rhythm and that melody right as well.
It's true. I mean, these are the elements that really take you beyond just getting the words right and into the realm of, adding that natural flow and rhythm that really helps you to sound more fluent.
Yeah, they give a couple of really good examples here. Like take the word record. If it's a thing, like an actual record, the vinyl disc,
Yeah.
you say record. But if it's something you do, like record a song, you say record.
Right.
And the emphasis completely changes the meaning.
It's a completely different word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a real light bulb moment, I think, when you realize that.
I think what's really interesting about English is that, we use that emphasis, that stress, to differentiate between words that are spelled the same but have different meanings, or sometimes even different functions in a sentence. So it's really a subtle tool, but it's incredibly important for being clear when you speak.
Yeah. And then there's intonation, how your voice goes up and down. The example they give is so clear. If you're asking a yes/no question,
Right.
like, are you coming?
Yeah.
Your voice usually goes up at the end. But if you're making a statement, I am coming, it goes down. And if you get that wrong, you can actually confuse people
Right.
about what you're actually trying to say.
And it raises a really interesting point that when we think about intonation, as listeners, we're using those cues, those rising and falling pitches, to understand the speaker's intention. So if you get the intonation wrong, it can change the perceived purpose of what you're saying, and that can obviously lead to misunderstandings.
And let's not forget about those tricky English vowel sounds.
Oh, yes.
That short I sound like in sit versus that long E sound like in C. I mean, they sound very similar, but they're different.
They are different.
And getting them mixed up can completely change the word.
The English vowel system is so complex. And, we have those subtle differences where you're moving your tongue, rounding your lips, changing the length of the vowel sound. All of those things have an impact on the actual sound. And so, it is a big challenge, particularly for people who come from languages with simpler vowel systems.
So the main takeaway here is that even if your grammar is perfect and, tons of vocabulary, if your pronunciation isn't clear, you're making communication harder.
That's right.
It's worth putting some effort into this.
It really is.
Yeah.
And then the source emphasizes this because they're saying, you can do all that hard work of learning grammar and vocabulary, but if people can't understand you because your pronunciation isn't clear, then all that work is kind of for nothing. So it's really about making sure that all that effort you put into learning the language actually pays off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And finally, the source talks about how when you know that you're pronouncing things clearly, it just makes you feel more confident.
Of course.
It's like a positive feedback loop.
It really is.
You speak clearly, people understand you, you feel good about it, you speak more clearly. So it really all works together.
Absolutely. And that, feeling of self-assurance, I think, really contributes to, a smoother, a more engaging way of speaking, which ultimately makes your communication more impactful.
So to get us ready for the rest of our deep dive, we're going to be looking at some key areas that the source highlights. We're going to start with individual sounds.
All right.
Then we'll talk about word stress.
Right.
Then sentence stress. And finally, intonation.
Sounds good.
Right. Let's get started with those individual sounds.
So when it comes to mastering those individual sounds of English, that's really the fundamental first step. The source breaks down English vowel sounds into three main categories. We have short vowels,
Okay.
we have long vowels, and we have diphthongs.
Okay, so short vowels, those are those really quick sounds, like the A in cat, the I in sit.
Right.
They don't really linger, do they?
Generally not. You can think of them as pure vowel sounds.
Yeah.
So the sound doesn't really change much while you're saying it, and they tend to be relatively brief.
And then we have long vowels, and these you kind of hold a little bit longer.
Yes.
And they often sound a bit like you're saying the name of the letter, like the A in cake, the E in C.
Exactly. So these are also pure vowel sounds.
Yeah.
But the main difference is that you hold them for a noticeably longer time than you hold those short vowel sounds.
And then we get to diphthongs.
Yes.
Which are a bit more interesting. These are like two vowel sounds that kind of smush together.
That's a great way to put it.
In the same syllable, like the oi in coin or the o in how. You can almost hear those two distinct sounds blending together.
And your mouth actually moves while you're making the sound. So you start with one vowel sound, and then your tongue or your lips will shift to create a slightly different vowel sound right after it all within the same syllable.
Yeah, the source really highlights that difference between the short I in sit and the long E in C again,
Yeah.
really emphasizing how important that length and that kind of feel of the sound is.
Right?
And they suggest that the best thing to do is just listen to native speakers
Yes.
and try and copy them.
Absolutely. And that kind of imitation, I think, is incredibly effective, where you're really paying attention to how native speakers are pronouncing these sounds, and then you're consciously trying to reproduce them yourself. That's a fantastic way to really start to internalize these subtle differences.
Okay, let's talk about consonants now.
Right.
The source makes the point that even though some consonant sounds might seem similar to sounds in your own language, there can be small differences that make a huge difference to the meaning of a word.
That's true. Even if you know the basic way you're making the consonant, whether it's with your lips or your tongue or whatever,
Yeah.
those things might feel familiar. But things like whether you vibrate your vocal cords or how much air you release, those can be quite different in English.
Yeah.
And that completely changes the sound.
Yeah, they use that example of the B sound in bat
Right.
and the P sound in pat.
Yeah.
You use your lips for both of them.
Right.
But with B, you can kind of feel that little vibration in your throat.
Exactly.
And with P, there's no vibration. So that tiny little difference is what tells you it's a different letter, a different word.
It's true. And that idea of whether your vocal cords are vibrating or not, that's what we call voicing. And English uses that voicing to differentiate between a lot of different sounds. So you have, your B and your P, your D, and your T, your G, and your K. All of those pairs are differentiated by whether your vocal cords vibrate or not. And that's a really important thing to pay attention to when you're learning to pronounce English correctly.
And then there's the infamous 3 sound.
Oh, yes.
The unvoiced one in think and the voiced one in this. That whole tongue between your teeth thing is a real challenge for a lot of people.
It's so specific. Those "the" sounds, we call them interdental fricatives.
Oh, wow.
But they require you to really get your tongue in that specific spot between your teeth.
Yeah.
And then you have to push the air out in a certain way. And then the added complication, of course, is that one of them is voiced and one of them is voiceless.
Okay, so now here's a really useful tip from the source. Practicing with what they call minimal pairs. These are words like think and thank, or ship and sheep, where only one sound is different. And it seems like a really good way to kind of train your ear and your mouth to notice those subtle differences.
I think minimal pair practice is a fantastic way to really focus your listening and your speaking on those individual sounds that can be tricky for you. And by contrasting words that are almost identical, you're really forcing yourself to pay attention to that single sound that makes the difference.
Yeah, and the advice is just to keep saying them over and over again.
Yeah.
They even suggest looking in a mirror as you practice so you can actually see what your mouth is doing.
Oh, that's a great tip. Yeah, and that way you can consciously try to match the position of your tongue, your lips, your jaw.
Yeah.
To either, what you see when you're looking in the mirror or to examples from native speakers. So that visual feedback can be incredibly helpful in correcting how you're forming sounds.
And then the slightly scary but apparently very helpful tip of recording yourself speaking so you can really compare your pronunciation to how native speakers sound.
Yeah, and I know it can feel awkward to listen to yourself.
Yeah.
But I think it really does help you to hear your pronunciation objectively.
Yeah.
And it can help you to pinpoint those areas where maybe your pronunciation is a little bit different from a native speaker's pronunciation.
The source also recommends just surrounding yourself with English as much as possible. Watching movies, TV shows, YouTube videos, anything where you're hearing native speakers talk.
Yes.
And the key is to try and mimic them. Pay attention not just to the sounds, but to how fast they're speaking, where they put the stress.
It's about all of those elements.
Everything.
Yeah, and that kind of immersion, I think, is incredibly valuable. It helps you to really just absorb the sounds of the language.
Yeah.
As well as all those other elements like rhythm and intonation and really helps you to kind of develop a more intuitive sense of how the language works.
And for those of us who love our phones, they mention language learning apps that have specific pronunciation exercises and even give you feedback.
Yeah, and a lot of those apps are really sophisticated now. They actually use, voice recognition technology and things like that to analyze your speech and tell you, how close your pronunciation is to a native speaker's. So they can be really helpful for targeting specific sounds that you're struggling with.
And they give some really good specific tips for dealing with those really challenging sounds. Like
Yeah.
breaking a sound like "soo"
Right.
down into smaller steps, using visual aids to really understand those vowel sounds.
Yeah.
And even just slowing down your speech so you have more control over what you're saying.
These are all great strategies because they give you really concrete ways to approach those difficulties, whether it's, figuring out how to move your mouth or just giving yourself more time to produce the sound correctly.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
finally, they list a whole bunch of resources where you can find more help.
Great.
Pronunciation guides, apps like Forvo and ALSA Speak,
Yeah.
YouTube channels dedicated to pronunciation, and online dictionaries.
Right.
So there's no shortage of places to go to practice.
Yeah, and the fact that there's so many resources available, I think really highlights how important pronunciation is and how, there's a lot of support out there for learners who are struggling.
Yeah, the key takeaway here is that really mastering those sounds takes consistent effort.
It really does.
You've got to put in the time to train your ears and your mouth.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about those individual sounds. Now let's move on to that thing that really makes English sound like English.
Well,
Stress and intonation.
right. And as the source points out, stress and intonation are absolutely vital for not just being understood, but for sounding natural when you speak English.
Yeah.
This is where we get into like the musicality of the language.
Now let's start with word stress. What is that?
So word stress is essentially the emphasis that you put on one of the syllables in a word.
Mm-hmm.
And that emphasis can be achieved by, making it louder, holding it a bit longer, or giving it a slightly higher pitch.
Okay.
And that emphasis is really key to understanding, what the word is and even differentiating between words that might be spelled the same.
And they use banana as the perfect example.
That's a great example.
Ba-na with the stress on that middle syllable. If you say it the wrong way, like B-N-A-N-A.
It sounds very odd.
Yeah, it just doesn't sound right at all.
Yeah, and it highlights the point that when you put the stress on the wrong syllable, it just sounds unnatural to native speakers.
Yeah.
And it can even make it harder for them to understand which word you're trying to say,
Yeah.
even if you get all the other sounds right.
Yeah, they give a general guideline that often with nouns and adjectives, the stress tends to be on that first part of the word.
Right.
Whereas with verbs and prepositions, it's more likely to be on the second part.
That's a good rule of thumb.
But then they immediately throw in exceptions,
Of course.
like photography versus photographic. So it's not a hard and fast rule.
There are always exceptions in English. But I think the point is that while there are some general patterns, English word stress isn't always predictable.
Mm-hmm.
And it can depend on things like, where the word originally came from or how it's formed. So it's really important to learn the stress pattern for individual words as you come across them.
Okay, so here's where it gets even more interesting. The source goes back to the word record again.
Okay.
Record when it's a thing you listen to,
Right.
but record when it's an action.
Exactly.
Just shifting the emphasis from the first syllable to the second completely changes the meaning.
Completely different meaning.
And they give another really good example, import, as in I import something that you bring into a country,
Right.
versus import the action of bringing something in.
Yes.
It really drives home how important word stress is for actually understanding.
That's right. It shows how stress isn't just about sounding right. It's actually about conveying the correct meaning. Because if you stress the word incorrectly, you might actually be saying something completely different from what you intend to say.
The source does mention that where you put this stress can sometimes vary a little bit depending on where you are in the English-speaking world.
Right.
But getting that general pattern right is
Yeah.
definitely going to make you more understandable.
I think that's a good point. There might be some minor regional variations, but the main patterns for most common English words are pretty consistent across different English-speaking countries.
Okay, so that's stress within a single word. Now let's talk about sentence stress. So which words do you emphasize when you're speaking a whole sentence?
So the basic rule is that the words that carry the main, meaning the content words, so your nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, those are the ones that usually get the emphasis or the stress. And then those smaller, more grammatical words, like the articles, prepositions, auxiliary verbs, those tend to be a little bit quieter, a little bit softer.
And they illustrate this really well with the sentence, I need to buy a new car.
Right.
With those key words,
Yeah.
need, buy car,
Yeah.
being the ones that you naturally emphasize.
Exactly.
Mm.
And if you stressed every single word equally, it would sound really robotic,
Yeah,
unnatural.
it wouldn't sound right at all.
No. And it would actually make it harder to understand what you're trying to say.
Yeah. And just like word stress, where you put the emphasis in a sentence, can completely change the meaning.
Oh, absolutely.
They give another really good example. I didn't say you stole the money
Right.
versus I didn't say you stole the money.
Yeah.
You're changing who you're denying said stole the money.
Exactly. And it really shows how, sentence stress isn't just about, rhythm. It's actually a tool that you can use to really highlight specific parts of your message and to even change the way people interpret what you're saying.
Now let's move on to intonation. So the actual up and down movement of your voice when you speak, this is what adds to real life the expressiveness.
Yeah. Intonation is like the melody of your speech.
Yeah.
And it plays a huge role in conveying meaning, whether you're asking a question, how you feel about something, all of those things.
They break down some of the main intonation patterns.
Right.
Like when you ask a yes or no question, like, are you coming?
Right.
Your voice usually goes up at the end.
That's right. And that rising pitch at the end of a yes or no question really signals to the listener that you are, in fact, expecting a yes or no answer.
But if you're asking a question that starts with who, what, where, when, why, or how, like where are you going, your voice usually goes down at the end.
That's right. That falling intonation tells the listener you're looking for information.
And with regular statements like, I'm going to the store, your voice tends to go down at the end as well.
Yes. A falling intonation is very common at the end of statements. It kind of signals that you're finished with your thought.
But then if you're expressing some really strong emotions like excitement or surprise, like, wow, that's amazing.
Right.
Your voice is going to go up and down in a much more varied way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your intonation will have a wider range.
Yeah.
More variation. You might have much higher pitches because you're expressing that excitement or surprise.
Yeah. And it's not just about the type of sentence. The source talks about how intonation can actually change the meaning of a single word. Like, really.
Yeah.
If you say it with a rising voice, it can sound like you're surprised or doubtful.
Right.
But if you say it with a falling voice, it sounds like you're confirming something.
Absolutely. And that really subtle difference can change how the listener understands your reaction or your attitude towards what's being said.
So how do you get better at using intonation correctly?
Well, I think the source has some good advice there. And a lot of it echoes what we've talked about already.
Yeah.
It's about listening to lots of native speakers.
Yeah.
Really paying attention to how their voice goes up and down.
In different situations.
Yeah, exactly. So, expose yourself to different kinds of speech, different contexts, and pay attention to how people are using intonation to convey meaning and emotion.
They also suggest reading aloud and trying to copy the intonation that you hear in recordings.
Right. Practice makes perfect.
So
And it's really about, trying to match what you hear so that you can train your voice to move in those natural English patterns.
And of course, recording yourself and comparing it to native speakers.
Yeah. And I know it can feel strange.
Yeah.
But it is really helpful to be able to hear yourself objectively and compare your intonation and see, is it matching up?
Yeah.
Where do I need to adjust?
And finally, they suggest practicing with specific intonation exercises, like saying the same sentence, like, she's going to the store, but trying to express different emotions,
I love that.
just by changing the intonation.
Yes, because exercises like that really help you to become more aware of, how you're using the pitch of your voice to express different feelings, different intentions.
The key message here is that if you don't get that stress and intonation, right, your English can sound a bit unnatural and even a bit flat,
Yeah,
even if you're pronouncing all the individual words correctly.
it's true. It's those elements, the stress and intonation, that really bring the language to life. And without them, your speech can sound a bit monotone.
Yeah.
It's less engaging.
Okay, so we've talked about the basic sounds, the music of stress and intonation. Now let's talk about some of the common challenges that learners face
All right.
when it comes to pronunciation.
So it can be really encouraging to know that, many English language learners actually make very similar pronunciation mistakes.
Yeah.
And the source addresses a number of these common mistakes and offers some ways to try to overcome them.
First up, getting those vowel sounds wrong,
Right.
especially those subtle differences in length and the quality of the vowel, like bit versus beat.
Yeah, and that can be tricky because in some languages, the length of the vowel doesn't change the meaning of the word.
Right.
So it's something that English learners really need to become aware of.
So the advice here is to really listen carefully to how long native speakers hold those vowels
Yes.
and the overall feel of the sound,
Yeah.
and then practicing those minimal pairs, bit, beat,
Right.
sit, seat,
Yeah.
hit, heat. Breaking the word down, saying it slowly, that can really help.
It's really about focusing on both the length of the vowel and the quality of the vowel, how you're shaping your mouth. And really just, lots of repetition, practicing those minimal pairs to really get those differences clear in your mind and in your speech.
Another really common issue is dropping the final sounds of words.
Right.
Like saying work, but it sounds more like work.
Yeah.
Walk, talk, bank.
Yeah, and that can be, often due to habits from the learner's first language,
Yeah.
where those final consonants maybe aren't pronounced as clearly or as fully.
So the solution there is to really make a conscious effort to pronounce every sound in the word, especially at the end.
Yeah, be deliberate about it.
The source recommends trying shadowing, which is where you listen to a native speaker and try and say it at the same time.
I love shadowing.
Yeah.
It's such a good technique because it really forces you to, internalize the pronunciation of the entire word, including those final sounds.
Yeah.
Because you're engaging both your listening and your speaking at the same time.
Then there are those dreaded consonant clusters. Those groups of consonants, like the Strian street
Yeah.
or the splenum splash, they can be like a real tongue twister.
Yeah, and those combinations of consonants can be difficult for learners
Yeah.
because, they might not exist in their native language, or the rules for how consonants can be combined might be different.
The strategy is to break the word down into those smaller parts.
Right.
So practice saying stry by itself
Yeah.
and then eat.
Yeah.
And then try and blend them together smoothly.
Exactly.
They give some other examples. Splendid, strong twin first. Lots of examples.
It's a good way to break it down and make it feel less overwhelming,
Yeah.
and to allow you to really focus on getting each sound right before you try to put it all together in the cluster.
Of course, we can't forget those thruth sounds.
Of course not.
The soft one and I think the slightly buzzy one in this.
Yeah.
Getting your tongue in the right place.
It's all about that tongue placement.
And figuring out if your vocal cord should be vibrating or not.
It's the voiced and the voiceless thruth. Again, the interdental fricatives.
And the advice here is to try saying the sounds by themselves, focusing on getting your tongue in the right spot.
Yeah.
Practice words like think thick thumb for that unvoiced sound.
Right.
This, that, there for the voiced sound. reading aloud, trying to copy how native speakers say it.
Yes, and doing that really helps you to just train your mouth to produce those sounds correctly.
And finally, that R sound. Like in red right car,
Yeah.
the source points out that this is often very different from the rolled R sound that you find in some other languages.
That's right. The English R sound is often much softer.
Yeah.
It's not that trilled or tapped R that you find in a lot of languages. So for the English R sound, it's more about, either curling your tongue back slightly or bunching it up kind of in the middle of your mouth.
Yeah.
But without actually letting the tip of your tongue touch the roof of your mouth.
Yeah.
So it's a very different kind of tongue position.
The tip here is to practice saying red
Okay.
without letting the tip of your tongue touch the roof of your mouth. And for words like car, that R sound at the end should be nice and soft.
Not overly rolled.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's really about, being aware of how your tongue should be positioned and consciously trying to avoid making that rolled R sound.
So it seems like a lot of pronunciation is just about awareness.
Yes.
Practicing these things in a focused way,
Absolutely.
listening carefully to how native speakers pronounce things.
Exactly. It's about training your ear and training your mouth.
So to kind of bring this deep dive to a close,
Okay.
we've looked at how important it is to get those individual sounds right, your
Right.
vowels, your consonants. Then how word stress and sentence stress help you to convey meaning and create that natural rhythm.
Right.
And finally, that intonation, the melody of English that adds all the expressiveness.
Absolutely.
And like we've said all along, the key is practice.
It really is.
Consistent practice.
You can't just read about pronunciation. You
Yeah.
actually have to do it.
So do
You have to get your mouth moving and really train your ear to hear those sounds.
Yeah. The source also encourages you to really pay attention to those common mistakes that we've been talking about and actively work on identifying them and correcting them.
Right. Become aware of those patterns, and then you can start to break those habits.
And they give so many resources.
Yeah.
So there's really no excuse for not practicing.
There's a lot of support out there.
So here's something to think about as you go about your day after listening to our deep dive. Pick just one small thing that we talked about.
Yeah.
Maybe it's finally getting the hang of that flip sound. Maybe it's focusing on where you put the stress in a few common words. And just consider how making even that one small improvement could really have a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Boost your confidence and make your next English conversation just that little bit clearer and more impactful.
I think that's a great takeaway.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us
Thanks for having me.
as we explore the depths of pronunciation.
Absolutely.
See you next time.
Bye.